Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us today for the annual Ralph F. Fuchs Lecture. The Fuchs Lectureship in Law was established in 1993 to honor Professor Ralph Fuchs, a long-standing and distinguished member of our faculty who served at the school from 1945 until his death in 1985. Professor Fuchs was an accomplished scholar and a teacher. He was pioneering in the area of administrative law. But he was equally well known for his lifelong commitment to public service and for his dedication, creativity, and compassion that he brought to that work. He was the first chairman of the executive board of the Indiana Civil Liberties Union. He was active in the NAACP and was appointed to its state committee on legal redress. He was also deeply committed to defending the rights of free speech, free press, and free assembly in the university context, eventually becoming president of the American Association of University Professors. The yearly Fuchs Lecture, in many ways, is one of the cornerstones of a wide-ranging series of public service programs here at the law school, from the work done in the 7 live client clinics to the 6 pro bono projects to the various vibrant student organizations. Each year is recognized at our Access to Justice sponsored award ceremonies. Students provide thousands of hours of pro bono public service without credit and without pay, and make a tremendous difference in the local community to those who need legal services the most. Past Fuchs Lectures have included some of the nation's top lawyers and legal scholars, all with a deep commitment to public service in different ways. They include Sir David Williams of Cambridge University, William Gold, former chairman of the National Labor Relations Board, Morris Dees, civil rights lawyer and co-founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Elliot Milstein, professor of law at the Washington College of Law and past president of the American Association of Law Schools, and last year, Professor Jerry King, a vice chancellor and professor of law at UCLA. It is an honor to add to that distinguished list today's speaker, Leti Volpp, the Robert D. and Leslie K. Raven Professor of Law in Access to Justice at Berkely Law School. Professor Volpp is a well-known scholar in law and humanities. She has written many influential law articles in the areas of citizenship, migration, culture, and identity. Before entering academia, Professor Volpp clerked for a federal judge and worked as a public interest lawyer. She served as a Skadden Fellow at Equal Rights Advocates and the ACLU's Immigrants' Rights Project, as a trial attorney in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and as a staff attorney at the National Employment Law Project. Her numerous honors include 2 Rockefeller Foundation Humanities Fellowships, a MacArthur Foundation Individual Research and Writing Grant, and the Association of American Law Schools Minority Section Derek A. Bell Jr. Award. She is an elected member also of the American Law Institute. Professor Volpp has delivered many public lectures, including the James A. Thomas Lecture at Yale Law School, the Korematsu Lecture at New York University Law School, and the Barbara Black Lecture at Columbia Law School. We're very pleased today that she is able to add the Fuchs Lecture to this distinguished list. Please join me in warmly welcoming this year's Fuchs Lecturer, Professor Leti Volpp.
First, let me say I'm deeply honored to be asked to deliver the Ralph F. Fuchs Endowed Lecture at Indiana University. I've been reading about Ralph Fuchs, and I'm thrilled to be able to deliver a lecture named after a person with such strong convictions about civil rights, civil liberties, and academic freedom. I'm really honored to give a lecture in his name. Let me also express my thanks to Dean Parrish and Carwina Wang for inviting me to share my thoughts with you today. So what I thought I would do is begin by explaining the genesis of this project and how it relates to some of my previous work. The focus of my scholarship is in particular on the legal imagination. So I research and write about how the nation imagines itself and patrols its borders through immigration law and citizenship law. And the communities I tend to think about are usually persons whose identity is considered in some way antithetical to the nation state. My research has clustered pretty strongly in 2 broad areas. The first focused upon questions raised by the relationship between culture and feminist theory, and the second upon questions of immigration law and citizenship studies. So in terms of the first area, I've looked at how presumptions about culture are deployed to enforce and exacerbate gender and racial subordination in a series of pieces which range from examining the use of the so-called cultural defense in criminal cases to the polarized debate pitting the values of feminism against that of multiculturalism, to examining how concerns about gender subordination expressed about non-Western cultures can function as a proxy for xenophobia, and in recent years, very strongly Islamophobia, as nation states respond to communities that they conceive of as illiberal minorities. Part of what I've argued is that the very idea of a culture clash between immigrant communities and majority communities presumes that a clash exists, because immigrants are presumed to be inheritors of a misogynist culture, whereas the West has a culture that is free or largely free of gendered subordination. What I've noted is that there's a selective practice of blaming culture for bad behavior. So the same act will be described differently depending upon the identity of an actor. When the actor is a member of a majority community, the actor is thought to be an individual deviant or somebody responding to psychological pressures. When the actor is a minority community member, it's thought of as the product of group culture. So the effect of this kind of selective blaming of culture on bad behavior is dehumanizing, because then only some of us are thought to be rational actors or motivated by psychology. And it's also depoliticizing, because culture is largely thought to be immune from questions of politics or material conditions. In terms of the second area around immigration and citizenship, I've looked at this both as a question of legal history as well as a contemporary concern. So I've been interested in how the experiences of certain communities disrupt what is otherwise presumed to be this smooth teleological process from lawful admission to naturalization to citizenship, both in terms of political participation and identification as a citizenship. I've worked a lot with a particular framework that the legal scholar Linda Bosniak has identified, where she read a lot of citizenship literature and said we can divide it into these four different discourses. Citizenship is formal legal status, what divides the citizen from the alien, what is on your passport. Secondly, citizenship is rights, right? We can think of this perhaps as the citizenship of constitutional law as opposed to immigration law. If you don't have all the rights that you think correlate with citizenship, people say, well, you have second-class citizenship. Thirdly, citizenship is political activity. This is citizenship as a verb. It's like the political practice, political participation of citizenship. And lastly, citizenship as identity, which is these ties of kinship, affective bonds of solidarity. Who do you imagine to be your fellow citizen? So the normal presumption about these four different discourses of citizenship is also that there's this kind of smooth progression. It's like you first become a citizen, then you get these rights, and then you become politically active, and then you're identified as a citizen. But in my research, I've looked to see how particular experiences trouble that assumption. For example, we can think of the phenomenon of second-class citizenship as one where you have somebody who, as a matter of formal legal status, is a citizen but doesn't have the rights that correlate. So, for example, somebody who's experienced felony disenfranchisement. We can also think about persons whose identity is thought of as in some ways antithetical to that of citizenship. So somebody who's presumptively a non-citizen or an alien, right? Where are you from? Or presumptively a terrorist, right? Post 9/11, certain communities are identified as terrorists and disidentified as citizens, even while they are formal status citizens. We can also think about how there are persons who don't have the formal status of citizenship, but nonetheless are politically active. For example, the population known as dreamers, right? Young people who are undocumented, who have done really phenomenal political work. But this troubling of this, these categories basically questions this notion that Hannah Arendt had famously articulated in The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is citizenship is the right to have rights, right? So we could see here, you can look from either end of that phrase and think, well, even if you have citizenship, do you have rights? Or if you don't have citizenship, is it possible to actually have some rights in this nation state? Okay, so this particular project departs from that previous work by looking in part at the construction of a population I haven't really focused on, which is that of the refugee, and also to look newly at how some of these concerns are manifested through visual culture, which I also haven't written about before. So I'm interested in how this visual culture is migrating transnationally, and I'm in particular interested in the mapping and the meanings and movement of a particular sign. So this is the sign. Posted along the southern border of the I-5 freeway, which runs from the U.S.-Mexico border, crossing at San Isidro, California, all the way to the border between the U.S. and Canada, are yellow signs depicting the silhouette of a man, woman, and female child in flight, captioned with the text "Caution." Several of these signs were posted by Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, along the I-5, both south and north of San Diego, starting in 1990. These signs still exist along the freeway, although they have outlasted their specific purpose, as I will explain. The sign was created in order to alert drivers to pedestrians crossing the freeway. Between 1987 and 1991, according to the New York Times, at least 227 people were struck by traffic trying to cross the freeway in order to avoid capture by immigration agents. 127 were killed. Particularly dangerous were two areas, one by the San Isidro checkpoint just north of the border, where 87 people were killed by cars as they tried to run into the United States, and the second, an area by Camp Pendleton, south of an interior border checkpoint at San Clemente, where another 40 had been killed. Agents at the San Clemente checkpoint seized 75,000 undocumented immigrants in 1990, which is a staggering number. But I was looking at GAO statistics reporting that approximately 144,000 vehicles passed through that checkpoint daily. So most of these immigrants were seized from the floors or trunks of vehicles. To avoid the checkpoint, immigrant smugglers would stop vehicles before reaching it, tell their passengers to cross 8 lanes of freeway, so 4 going north, 4 going south, and continue up north along the west side of the freeway, which is basically along the coast, like along beach. And then after the immigrants had skirted the checkpoint, recross the freeway again, the smugglers would pick them up on the other side of the checkpoint. Many immigrants were seen, quote, in the early evening hesitating by the side of the road before dashing, often hand in hand into the oncoming traffic, close quote. Most accidents occurred between 8 p.m. and midnight. Many immigrants were from rural areas and did not realize the speed of freeway traffic. Victims ranged in age from 3 years old to 80. In the words of Captain Ronald Phelps, commander of the Oceanside Office of the California Highway Patrol, they usually cross in groups of people rather than 1 or 2 at a time. Often they are holding hands, forming human chains, and the chain gets broken as these people try to cross the highway. Often what you get is a group of people running in different directions at the moment of panic. Much like a pinball machine, you don't know which way an individual may be darting. So text signs, let me take my clicker. Text signs were initially posted by Caltrans urging, caution, watch for people crossing road, but their wordiness made them difficult to decipher. Caltrans then asked a graphic artist named John Hood to design an image that would, in the blink of an eye, alert drivers. Before Hood began drawing the sign, he and his supervisors met with Highway Patrol and saw photos of accident scenes. Moved particularly by the deaths that involved families, he decided to show a family which showed a sense of urgency in flight, running both across the freeway and, he said, running from something else as well. Hood, who had grown up on the Navajo reservation in New Mexico, drew on his own experiences fighting in Vietnam, where he had seen families run for their lives as villages were attacked, and also remembered stories about his ancestors who had died trying to escape from U.S. soldiers. The first graphic signs were unveiled in September 1990 at Camp Pendleton. To try to further deter freeway crossers, Caltrans put tall fences in the center divider along I-5 shortly thereafter. But the graphic signs and the tall fences ultimately were not primarily responsible for decreasing the freeway deaths. What is this. Beginning in 1994, the federal government embarked on a strategy of attempting to deter illegal migration through Operation Gatekeeper. The idea was to stem the tide of illegal immigration crossing the border from Mexico into the United States through shifting the remaining traffic eastward, where the Border Patrol believed it enjoyed a strategic advantage over would-be crossers. By moving migration away from popular suburban migration routes around San Diego, controlling what the government called the main gates of illegal entry, in the words of then Commissioner of the INS Doris Meissner, quote, geography would do the rest, close quote, meaning that crossings would be deterred because of the topography and the climate of Arizona. The primary fence was welded together corrugated steel landing mats obtained from the Department of Defense and left over from the Vietnam War, erected along stretches of the border starting at the ocean. Other sections were closely spaced concrete poles. I had gone on a tour with the Border Patrol in the San Diego sector in 2001, and I remember being told that the reason these poles were spaced as they were, 5 or 6 inches apart, was because the area bridging Mexico and the United States is a transnationally protected wetland. And the idea was that non-human animals would still be able to cross, right? So it's like too small for a human body, but big enough for certain non-human animals. And in searching for documentation of this point for this talk, I found much concern about how wildlife have been negatively impacted through the border wall, and also something else which I thought was a spoof. But since it's on the PETA website, I actually think it's real. But basically, it's exhorting immigrants seeking to cross the border to be more healthy by becoming vegans, which you can see here. Thinking about the relationship between human and animal movement is, of course, also spurred by the sign itself, which evokes nothing more than a sign warning drivers of deer crossing. And thinking of deer crossing signs, I think we should ask, is their purpose pastoral care, a kind of humanitarianism directed at deer to protect them from injury, or is it to protect motorists from vehicular accidents? And linked to this question, a couple people have told me, oh, you have to listen to this call to this radio station that went viral from a woman named Donna who said officials should no longer encourage deer to cross at particular deer crossing signs because of these car accidents. In other words, Donna believed the deer were obeying the signs and only crossing at the deer crossing signs. And then I also read that some people think this was a hoax, and they actually trace this story to a letter published in the Indiana Times in August 2011 by a man named Tim Abbott, who wrote that the deer crossing signs needed to be moved away from US 231 west of Crown Point because there were too many cars to have a deer crossing there. So when he was later interviewed, he said he was just trying to get a little rise out of people. Okay. So creating a wall and a militarized border between the United States and California was successful in deterring and decreasing illegal crossing near San Diego. So that this was successful is apparent in government data about apprehensions. So you can see from this slide that it is the case that attempts to cross in the San Diego, Chula Vista, San Isidro sectors, the red, ivory, orange ones, dramatically decreased due to this strategy. But you can also see that crossings were not entirely deterred, right? They merely shifted east to Arizona, which are the blue symbols here, which represent apprehensions near Tucson. So as we know, the strategy of shifting border crossing east correlated with an intense escalation in deaths. So the injunction to, quote, let geography do the rest, in fact, becomes a gruesome message not about deterrence, but about death. So this is a slide from the medical examiner of Pima County, which sits in the center of Arizona's southern border with Mexico, and the figures represent dead bodies that were found. And if you go today to the Tijuana side of the wall that exists between California and Mexico, each of these crosses represents somebody who died trying to cross the border. As a side note, this movement of illegal border crossing east to Arizona created the preconditions for SB 1070, the Arizona Save Our State initiative, which the Arizona legislature passed in 2010 to try to encourage undocumented immigrants to engage in self-deportation. And to return to the Caltrans sign, this movement of border crossing away from California also rendered this sign something of a relic in terms of its intended role. Yet the sign lives on in various contexts, and I think it is worth probing what it means. In an article titled Official Graffiti of the Everyday, sociologists Joe Hermer and Alan Hunt examine the spatial aspects of regulatory prohibition in the form of signs such as road traffic signs, entry or exit signs in public buildings, and signs stating no smoking. They call these signs official graffiti. Traffic signs appear to Hermer and Hunt as the paradigm case of the ability of these signs to create a discourse of prohibition, warning, and advice, whose authority comes not just from a legal authority exemplified in the road sign, but also from standardization and impersonal, fixed, and permanent form. Prohibitory signs, such as the sign no smoking, are, according to Hermer and Hunt, never simply iconic injunctions. They're part of a much larger series of articulations that seek to direct the behavior of people in a wide variety of social situations and spaces. So the sign is not just about behavior at the site of the sign, and the behavior being controlled by the sign is not only controlled by the sign. So here I want to call your attention to the fact that some of the Caltrans signs were labeled with words both in English and Spanish. This is one placed by the San Clemente border stop. So you may notice that the two words, if you know Spanish, the two words on this sign actually do not mean the same thing. Prohibido does not mean caution. It means variously prohibited, forbidden, taboo, barred, restricted, and no. Caution here is clearly directed at the motorist. Prohibido is clearly directed at the undocumented immigrant. So the motorist is presumptively English-speaking, the undocumented immigrant is presumptively Spanish-speaking, even while maybe a third of the population in San Diego in the early 1990s spoke Spanish. So even while both parties are being addressed here, this is not a symmetrical relationship. As Hermer and Hunt point out, regulatory signs invoke a common underlying discursive framework. This shared form involves a construction with three elements: an implied reader, an implied regulatory object, and an implied author who exercises regulatory authority. Here there are two implied readers, the driver and the undocumented immigrant. The driver who is cautioned and the undocumented immigrant who is forbidden. The mode of articulation directed at the driver and the undocumented immigrant diverge. As a mode of articulation, a prohibition differs from a caution, which we could consider a warning or an alert. Prohibition orders the reader to cease and desist, whereas a warning or an alert allows the reader to exercise his judgment in proceeding with a particular activity. The implied regulatory object here seems twofold, both driving conduct and the crossing of the freeway by pedestrians. Yet, I would argue the implied regulatory object is actually threefold. Also regulated here is the undocumented immigrant herself. So the implied regulatory object is not just the conduct of these bodies, it is these bodies themselves. The sign does not just tell the undocumented immigrant that running across the freeway is forbidden, their own existence is prohibido or forbidden as well. We could consider the fact that the original purpose for these signs, decreasing freeway deaths along the I-5, has been made moot by the shifting border strategy, but these signs are still posted. As a result, what do drivers learn passing these signs? Many drivers assume that it means that illegal immigrants are a generic danger that they are to be cautioned against. The implied author exercising regulatory authority here, of course, is the government, which through this sign is simultaneously telling drivers to drive cautiously and engaging in pastoral humanitarian care, trying to ensure that humans are not killed. But the government is also responsible for the policing of the border, which creates the phenomenon of illegal migration in the first place. I do recognize that Caltrans is a state entity, while the federal government is responsible for the nation-state border and the laws defining who is legal and illegal. At the same time, the early 90s were the era of Pete Wilson as governor in California. Prop 187, which represented the peak of California's attempt to assist the federal government in the policing of illegal immigration, was passed in 1994. So both drivers and immigrants are being told here that illegal immigrants are prohibited. The illegal alien, quote unquote, is, in the words of the historian May Nye, a subject who is not supposed to exist. Rather than understanding the quote unquote illegal alien as a creation of shifting laws which can make and unmake illegal migration, the illegal alien is believed to have committed, through her presence, a personal sin, which can only be expiated through her self-deportation. She can only make the wrong go away by ceasing to exist. Okay, so what has happened with this sign? In the U.S. context, this immigrants running sign has been deployed as a symbol of illegal immigration. First, by those who oppose undocumented immigrants. Let me just show you three examples. This is on a Tea Party blogger site. It pairs a rendition of the original sign under the caption "Before Amnesty" with an illustration of the running immigrants multiplied tenfold under the caption "After the Amnesty." So it is intended to warn of the dangers of amnesty, such as was created in 1986 through the Immigration Reform and Control Act, legalizing undocumented immigrants. The suggestion is that any future amnesty will lead to a massive influx of illegal immigrants entering the country. Note also the word aviso, which can mean warning, but can also mean notice or advertisement. And so, like prohibido is not a literal translation of caution, and can be then doubly read as both warning of a danger, but also advertising a benefit, right? The second sign inveighs against what it labels Obama-igration, by which term the author means deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA, as well as deferred action for parents of Americans, or DAPA, with the latter currently pending before the Supreme Court. While most legal scholars think that these programs were created via constitutionally permissible prosecutorial discretion, members of the public, as indicated through this representation, perceive DACA and DAPA as monarchical, unconstitutional lawmaking, and as actually creating a legal status for undocumented immigrants, which these programs do not do. The idea that you could see here that, quote, you don't need no papers, belies the fact while on DACA one is still undocumented, but also that one is documented, meaning there are papers of a sort associated with this liminal existence. Okay, this third figure portrays this image in conjunction with the term Republican candidate for president Ted Cruz is popularizing, namely undocumented Democrats. As he stated in December, proponents of the Gang of Eight, those were the members of the Senate who actually sponsored comprehensive immigration reform in 2013, including Marco Rubio, according to Ted Cruz, quote, were being hypocrites. They were not telling the truth. What they were interested in, what Chuck Schumer and Barack Obama wanted, was very simple. They wanted millions of new Democratic voters. There's a reason why I think the new politically correct term is no longer illegal aliens. It's undocumented Democrats, close quote. But the sign has also been redeployed in ways that question the linkage of this image with the condemnation of, quote unquote, illegal immigrants. Note that each of the following three signs reformulates the identity of the three figures running, forcing the viewer to reconsider who are the man, woman, and child in the frame, unlike in these three images, which take that identity for granted. So here's one positioning the trio as Joseph, Mary, and the baby Jesus, raising the idea of sanctuary, the Holy Family seeking refuge, asking, is there room at the inn? Is there room in the nation state? Here you see pilgrims as undocumented illegal immigrants, suggesting that the valorized founding fathers entered the United States without permission, so that their moral or legal stature should be considered equivalent to today's undocumented immigrant. The image also suggests the illegitimacy of the U.S. as a nation-state formation, an illegitimacy which has been masked by the casting of the U.S. as a nation of immigrants rather than as a settler colonial state. And this image recasts the three figures as dreamers, meaning undocumented immigrants who arrived as children. In the language of advocates, some advocates for politicians, these individuals are, quote, here through no fault of their own, which implicitly blames their parents, and they're depicted as possessing exemplary human capital. Notice the mortarboards. So they are positioned as, quote unquote, the cream of undocumented immigrants who, because of the Supreme Court case Plyler versus Doe, allowing undocumented children to attend public elementary and secondary school, are assimilated as American as children with a subsequent shock of learning to be illegal, in the sociologist Roberto Gonzalez's words, when they, for example, apply for driver's license or for college. And just to say that notion of being the cream and, here through no fault of their own, those are notions that dreamers have rejected, right? Saying, I don't want to be divided from my parents in that way. And then there's this image, which is a more ambiguous and I think a very interesting sign. This is a photo of a protest against H.R. 4437, the Border Protection, Anti-Terrorism, and Illegal Immigration Control Act, which was also known as the Sensenbrenner Bill, which would have, among other changes, criminalized unlawful presence, which is not currently a criminal offense under immigration law. So this is the bill that was the spur to the mega marches in 2006 when millions of immigrants took to the streets. One of these protests being depicted here. And so, to me, very interestingly, the image appears in an appeal to allow immigrants to migrate legally, right, to become legal residents through an officially sanctioned regularization program or through what can also be called an amnesty, rather than illegally. In not reformulating the image of the three figures, for example, as the Holy Family or dreamers or pilgrims, it is a more ambiguous sign, both in that it appears to be referencing illegal immigrants and in its appearing to invoke a concept frequently invoked by opponents of illegal immigration, namely there's a right way to enter the United States, which is to opt for legal immigration routes and to go to the back of the line. So this sign could be juxtaposed with the previous sign before the amnesty, after the amnesty. Both represent a before that appears similar, right? But the after presents a stark divergence in terms of what after the amnesty would look like, right? An uncontrolled mass influx versus an orderly, calm movement. This orderly, calm movement suggests in the posture of the figures the self-possessed and self-controlled ideal of the upright citizen, in contrast to those whose bodies are pressed through the pressures that created their desperate flight. The juxtaposition also suggests the picture of evolutionary progression to the upright human from the ape, correlating lawfulness with full humanity. So notice that regardless whether any of these 7 signs project a favorable or negative vision of undocumented immigration, they are very much about so-called illegal immigrants. That is the clear reference. A photo of this original traffic sign hangs in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, one floor down from the original 1813 Star-Spangled Banner, the flag that inspired the national anthem. According to curator Peter Leopold, quote, "It transcends its local history. Its importance is as a metaphor for undocumented immigration into the United States." So I became very interested in the migration of this sign transnationally. So I was looking at images on the web of Germany in August 2015, which accompanied this incredible decision of Chancellor Angela Merkel to take in refugees in the worst refugee crisis since World War II, and in the very moving reaction of many from the creation of this program, Flüchtlinge Willkommen, which is basically an Airbnb for linking up refugees with housing, to, I'm sure you saw depictions of people greeting refugees arriving in train stations with applause, food, toys, clothes. So I was really shocked when I was looking at some of this coverage and I suddenly saw the same image, the silhouette of a man, woman, and female child holding hands while running, the original image of the traffic sign, on banners welcoming refugees in football stadiums, soccer stadiums, in Germany in August 2015. That month, Germany had stated that all Syrian asylum seekers would be welcome to remain. By early September, Chancellor Merkel announced the country would take in over 800,000 refugees, and the number of refugees Germany admitted in 2015 topped 1.1 million. On September 10th, 2015, President Obama announced that the U.S. would take in, quote, at least 10,000 Syrian refugees in the following year. One could note that the population of Germany is 81 million, meaning that Germany has taken in over 1% of its population as refugees, and that the population of the U.S. is 321 million. Germany was, at that point, mostly in a state of euphoric welcome, and banners with refugees welcome were a frequent sight, such as this one at the Frankfurt train station, or this one also exhorting the reader to note that Dortmund tolerates no racism. The conjoining of the image with refugees welcome and bring your families also frequently appeared, sometimes with 2 female and 2 male figures together flanking 2 children, perhaps to mute the implicit heterosexuality or homonormativity of the initial image. We can note here the vision of the nuclear heterosexual family as the ideal unit of refugee welcome, against the concern that most of those entering Europe are young single men. The warm German response to the refugee crisis has been colloquially known as Willkommenskultur, or welcome culture, reflecting the sign Refugees Welcome, which stands in stark contrast to the United States. So interestingly, I note a transnational migration of the sign in its welcoming European incarnation back to the United States, suggesting that the visual image has refracted back in a form of critique of the United States, visible in 2 signs I found. The first accompanying an article about a rally supporting the welcome of refugees in Idaho on September 11th, the other at a photo of a rally in New York on September 12th. In other words, there is a way in which this particular image associated with the text "Refugees Welcome" is in the U.S. now specifically associated with the Syrian refugee crisis. Recall that it was on September 10th that President Obama announced the plan to admit 10,000 Syrian refugees. As we know, this announcement by President Obama was met by subsequent political opposition. After the November 13th Paris attacks, governors of 31 states, including this one, said they would not accept Syrian refugees. Graphically illustrated in this ad from then Republican candidate Ben Carson's presidential campaign, which weirdly has lost New England from the map. I don't know if you noticed that. Texas unsuccessfully sued to stop the resettlement of Syrian refugees, and Indiana was affirmatively and as of February 29th successfully sued by Exodus, a refugee organization with the help of the ACLU, countering the governor's order blocking state agencies from helping to resettle Syrian refugees. The House of Congress passed legislation in December to slow the already glacially paced entry of Syrian refugees into the U.S., but this did not make it through the Senate in January 2016, which was more preoccupied with tightening the visa waiver program after the San Bernardino attacks on December 2nd, 2015. After those attacks, Donald Trump called for a ban on all Muslims seeking to enter the United States, although he did later clarify this might not include Muslims seeking to attend sporting events or U.S. citizens. Ted Cruz has said the U.S. should only admit Christian refugees, and Marco Rubio ducked the issue by saying he doesn't think the U.S. should admit refugees at all. Of course, Cruz and Rubio are in the United States because of U.S. recognition of Cuban refugees who receive special preference through the Cuban Readjustment Act, so that any Cuban who arrives and touches land is paroled or administratively allowed into the United States, and after 1 year with no criminal conduct can actually become a legal permanent resident or green card holder. And since the restoration of diplomatic relations means this policy will probably be canceled, hundreds of Cubans are currently crossing the border each day with an ease of passage which stands in stark contrast to the detention of Central Americans. Meanwhile, in Germany, 2 events in 2015 flipped refugees welcome to refugees unwelcome: the Paris attacks and then the attacks in Cologne on New Year's Eve, which led to 497 women filing complaints of sexual assault. While the facts remain murky, reporting indicates that 18 of 31 persons tied to the assaults were asylum seekers. Most persons involved were believed to have been, in the German term, people with a migration background, but not refugees, rather long-term residents primarily from North Africa, some with outstanding deportation orders who were already known to engage in petty theft and drug dealing. We can anticipate that the terrorist attacks in Brussels a few days ago flip welcome to unwelcome even further. So the response to the attacks, the German response to the attacks conflates the refugee with rapist. So what I want to show you are 3 banners from a demonstration organized in Leipzig by Pegida, the group Patriotische Europäer gegen die Islamisierung des Abendlandes. Abendlandes meaning the West, like as opposed to the Orient, the Occident, the land of the setting sun. A far-right party which was only founded in 2014, but which has been expanding rapidly in Europe. So 2 of the banners reformulate the image of the running immigrants, suggesting that in the German context, the man, woman, and child running and holding hands is synonymous not with caution, but with refugees welcome. So here's the first image. Which reformats the man, woman, and child to be 3 men holding weapons chasing a fleeing woman, with text stating rape refugees not welcome, with rape and not in red, correlating with the men's bodies, and with small text reading stay away. So there are obviously many ways in which the events in Cologne track already existing concerns about gender and Islam, which have long been part of a vision of rapacious Muslim men and suffering and submissive Muslim women. In this second image from the protests, Angela Merkel appears in hijab and is told, "Take your Muslims with you," and get lost, with her head covering, correlating with a troubling difference. We know the veil is, along with the honor crime, the iconic symbol of the particular subjugation of Muslim women. And in this third image, the woman is actually refigured as an equal partner in terrorist threat. expelled by the Christian upon his horse in a neo-crusade. So here the burqa appears as a symbol not so much of a submissive woman, but a convenient cover for terrorist weaponry and threat. The banner says, "Islamists not welcome." The running figures are presumptively Islamic terrorists pursued by a Christian knight, with smaller text that reads, "Stay back or we'll kick you back." So the New York Times covered the attack in Cologne with articles titled in different editions, "Cologne attacks highlight clash among cultures," and also "Sexual assaults in Germany point to a culture clash." So as I had mentioned earlier, I've written about the problems with framing gendered violence as cultural. Suffice it to say for now that culture is now the terrain on which racism can be articulated. As the German newspaper Der Spiegel points out, every year during Oktoberfest, there are sexual assaults, including rapes. And in a survey done of German women, nearly 60% said they'd been sexually harassed. And as Der Spiegel points out, it's impossible that every single person doing this harassing was Muslim or from North Africa. So reflecting on all of this, it's perhaps not surprising that the image of running immigrants has been mostly differently understood in the U.S. and Europe, and the U.S. as an iconic image of illegal immigration, in Europe as the refugee who had been welcomed and is now cast as a rapist and terrorist. It is more difficult to enter Europe without inspection and work than in the United States, given national identity cards in Europe, so an asylum application is one of the few ways to enter a European country. So there's thus an analog between the U.S. illegal immigrant and the European refugee, particularly when the would-be refugee becomes an unsuccessful asylum seeker but does not leave. These are the populations of irregular migration, the illegal immigrant, the failed asylum seeker, that cause nation-states concern. At the same time, these are populations which are racialized differently from the vantage point of the United States. The illegal immigrant in the United States, even while 40% of people who are undocumented are visa overstayers, not border crossers, is presumptively, in the eyes of the public, a border crosser, and specifically from Mexico. The refugee is, at this moment in the United States, presumptively not Mexican or attempting to enter the U.S. from Mexico, but instead is imagined as someone who enters the U.S. from overseas. But the U.S. has two different refugee programs. One is the overseas program that admits maybe 70,000 people a year. This is the one that President Obama said he would add 10,000 admissions for Syrians. And there's an onshore program for people who show up at the border and request asylum either immediately or shortly after entry. And the U.S. admits maybe 20 to 30,000 people annually through the onshore program. To be admitted under either program, onshore or overseas, requires being legally recognized as a refugee rather than merely an economic migrant. So our onshore program is like the European refugee crisis, right, of people showing up. Geography means that the U.S. is not subject to over 1 million Mediterranean sea arrivals, but it does not mean that the U.S. has no onshore refugees. And here I think the way that this sign is deployed shows us how in the current moment refugees from Central America are denied and forgotten. Central American refugees disappear behind the vision of the undocumented immigrant and behind the vision of in the eyes of some, presumptively deserving, and in the eyes of others, presumptively threatening, overseas refugee. So I'm thinking here of the women and children from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, who've been put on a so-called rocket docket, limiting meaningful due process and access to competent counsel, treated as surge cases, imprisoned in massive detention facilities constructed and operated by the Corrections Corporation of America, costing taxpayers over $800,000 a day to operate, and who now, since Christmas, have been subject to raids and deportations by an administration eager to deter additional arrivals from that region, with a refusal to recognize that UNHCR estimates that maybe 82% should be recognized as refugees. So there's this kind of triangulation that's going on between the illegal immigrant and the refugee. Refugees and illegal immigrants are conceptualized as different categories so that one cannot encompass the other, even while someone who's undocumented can be legally recognized as a refugee, and even while the failed asylum seeker can turn into the undocumented immigrant. These are, in other words, mutable statuses which can be made and unmade by shifts in legal recognition, yet our notion of these categories are fixed to visions of different populations because these categories are racialized. So let me actually skip a little bit because of time and just end with two images created by the street artist Banksy. Okay, so this first one is called Kite 2, and it was spotted in Los Angeles in February 2011. There's no text. The man is holding a kite, right? So We could maybe read this as the transformation of the sign to one of hope. The trio are not running from desperation, but to keep their kite aloft. And the kite also flies outside the borders of the sign, suggesting we might imagine otherwise, perhaps an alternative to a world in which nation-state borders produce so much suffering. That this image was called Kite 2 made me wonder, well, what is Kite 1? Okay, so this is actually Kite 1, which was spotted in New Orleans, and it depicts a child holding a refrigerator aloft as a kite. It was painted on a wall in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And so while at least one viewer found this, quote, an unexpectedly whimsical slant on our memories of the reeking refrigerators that lined the street after the 2005 flood, it reminds me of the controversy as to whether to label African American citizens of New Orleans abandoned by their government refugees, right? So putting Kite 1 and Kite 2 together, Banksy can perhaps be understood to suggest the impossibility of flight. Thank you.
Hi. This is just something that your talk reminded me of, that I was wondering if you've heard of this, or it may be something that you would be interested in looking in, but just when you showed how the sign sort of was used differently in Germany, I have a friend that's a research fellow in Germany right now, and he was posting pictures on Facebook of how the United States Confederate flag is being used there in various contexts for protest or just people hanging on their fences outside of their houses and wondering what's going on here, and like how is that symbol sort of being used, or how has it changed, and so that kind of just reminded me of that, and I wonder if you had come across anything like that, just like the way that a symbol is sort of changed as it goes transnational.
That is totally fascinating. I didn't know that the U.S. Confederate flag has appeared in Germany. I think so. One thing I should say is that the refugees welcome sign, it's not limited to Germany. It's a European phenomenon. I tried to do Google image to trace this, and the first depiction I saw with those figures running and the text "refugees welcome," I could find dated to 2007, and it was like anti-fascist. It was like an anti-fascist like T-shirt. You could buy this T-shirt. So part of what interests me as well is like linguistically, right? Refugees welcome is obviously in English, and ways in which these kind of neo-right parties in Europe as a whole, to what extent is English the language that they're communicating in? When I looked at the web a couple days ago to prepare for this, I hadn't actually checked the refugees welcome sign and what had happened for a few weeks. There's even more stuff like images that I didn't want to show you that are just completely gruesome and are clearly the product of organized, using very particular racialized depictions showing women getting raped, sort of illustrations of women getting raped, and with text in English, right? So I think that there's organized racist organization, and the idea that the Confederate flag could perhaps appear as a totem of this is absolutely fascinating. So thank you.
given what I know about hate crimes in Germany and individuals who are not German citizens who are white, right? So it's not just with respect to national origin, but you know.
Yeah, so, I mean, the things I can say quickly about this are, so in 2000, Germany actually did reform its citizenship law. So Germany had stood as the exemplar of citizenship through blood, jus sanguinis, right? So, like, only people with German blood could be citizens, like, even if they resided outside of Germany for generations. So they've actually restricted the indefinite passing on of citizenship overseas to people of German descent, and have also made it possible for persons born in Germany with no German blood to actually become citizens. Although what they do is something that many people in the United States actually want to move towards, which is not have this kind of unfettered birthright citizenship, but condition it upon what is the legal status of the parents, right? So it's sort of like birthright in the territory plus something else. Right? So that's what, when the Congress in the United States keeps having the birthright citizenship bills, this is part of what they try to do. The other thing I would say is that there's a lot of discussion about, well, why did Angela Merkel do this, right? I mean, this is like staggering to think of taking 1% of your population in as refugees. And there are many different theories. One of them has to do with her growing up with her minister father, growing up in East Germany, seeing, people trying to flee East Germany for the West as refugees. Is this some kind of expiation for the Holocaust, right, for what Nazi Germany did sort of in the eyes of the world? And then the sort of cynical, like Germany has an aging population, a lot of, the early wave of refugees, particularly from Syria, are well educated, and it's like you've got like now a new young workforce, although linguistically, obviously, it takes a lot of time to integrate immigrants into your social and labor fabric. But it does feel definitely like the temperature about this has really shifted with the terrorist attacks in Cologne, right?
It was a great talk.
Thank you.
So much. I'm interested in knowing whether you've seen any of the use of that image in Latin America. So specifically in Central America and Mexico, which itself is a receiving country and is having difficulty thinking about how to reform its immigration policy because of Central American migration northward. But then also in southern South America, where there's also a significant influx of migration, of people through migration. And so I'm really interested in knowing whether the sort of the source that sign was originally created to communicate to, or the people whom that sign was originally intended to communicate to, whether those locations, whether Latin America has used that sign, that symbol, in any ways that are interesting.
So I did actually look to see, like, okay, if you say refugios, what would be the term? Bienvenidos. Like, I sort of had searched with Spanish words, and the only text like that I found was actually in Spain, suggesting that this is like a European phenomenon and not one in Central or South America. But I will say it wasn't an exhaustive search. But yes, so it's a really, really great question. And so part of it I was interested to think, like, is it the case that if this is a European phenomenon, what does this mean about, refugees in Central or South America, right? So.
Right. I was really going back to the Confederate flag issue. If you go to Split, a city in Croatia, their fans use the Confederate battle flag as the southern rebellious city against Zagreb. So it's interesting how that motif can cross the ocean in different ways. I was really interested in your take on the gendered aspects. I never noticed before that the drawing of the sign on the Caltrans freeway. The mother has a relatively long skirt, and then and it's the daughter. It just seemed like more of a 1950s or 60s image of a family than probably what you would expect today. At least that was my first impression. And I was curious if you've seen any changes to it that would kind of update it to today, or maybe more masculinize certain things, or still focus on protecting the feminine?
That's really interesting. What I've read about this is that the artist, John Hood, had, in the sense that it's gendered, you notice it's a female child, and I think this was for two reasons. One of them was her pigtails or ponytail can suggest movement or flight, right? And then also that maybe people feel more compassionate. Like I think it was trying to get people to be compassionate. Although there's also the sort of strangeness of this as this kind of flat silhouette. A colleague in the English department was actually just telling me that this reminds her of the fugitive slave posters that, advertisements that were distributed in the U.S., which had a kind of generic silhouette of a male or female person who was enslaved. And apparently the artist John Hood had tried to, he sort of thought about like facial features, but it was anything that sort of distracted the viewer and made it more complicated was something that was discarded. So anyway, so I haven't seen, I think part of it, it's the idea is it's a stock image. I haven't seen changes in terms of the female dress changing. I have seen, actually, interestingly, I don't have a slide of it here. There's also a depiction of Refugees Welcome where you see more people, including somebody, I think it's a woman in a wheelchair, right, suggesting like we welcome you as a refugee, including, people who are physically disabled. But I haven't seen changes in terms of the maybe 1950s skirt length. So, yeah.
We're out of time, so please join me in thanking.
Thank you.